Hey guys, this is Joseph Mazerac and welcome back to the Blue Deck Podcast. This is our first off-season show. We have something a little different in store for you. During the next few episodes, before beginning Season 2, we have a guest host, Dalyn Woods. She's prepared some questions for me, and we hope you enjoy listening to my interrogation. Dalyn is a good friend and a fellow writer. Her book, My Sister's Keeper, is available on Amazon. Also, her new book, The Bride Escape, will be out soon. So if you're listening to this podcast sometime in the future, chances are that book is available also. With that said, here's Dalyn Woods.
We're here with author and podcast narrator of Into the Attic of the World, Joseph Mazerac. I'm your host, Dalyn Woods. So, Joe, in Attic of the World, Charles lives in Orange Park, Florida.
Right.
Is that where you grew up?
No, it's not actually. I moved there about a dozen years ago or so, and I moved away a few times and then come back. But the last 12, 13 years, that's where I try to call my home as much as possible.
Okay, so where else did you live?
I had a lot of places. My dad was in the Army all my growing up years, so I was born in Germany. You didn't know that?
I did not know that, and I have family in Germany. That's so interesting.
Yeah.
So now you're going to have to tell me what part.
Nuremberg is where I was born, and I guess Dad was stationed in Grafenwehr. Okay. But I moved when I was a little baby. Don't really remember it. We moved from there to Alabama, then from Alabama to North Carolina, and then up to Alaska and Texas, Missouri, and Florida. I finally graduated high school in Georgia, and it was my fourth high school. I don't recommend doing that, but, we moved around an awful lot in those days. And then in my own career, after growing up, we moved around probably even more, my wife and I. I met her out west in California. We lived in Nevada and Texas and Florida and Georgia, some of the other places that I'd lived before, but hopefully those days are behind me.
So how old were you when you lived in Alaska? Do you remember that?
All my middle school years were in Alaska, yeah. We were up there 4 years total.
And yet you chose to set your story in Orange Park, Florida.
Yeah, because Orange Park feels like home. Yeah.
And where is Orange Park? Because I know where it is and you know where it is, but some people may not know where that is, and it's probably not on big map.
Right. Well, Jacksonville, Florida is right on the northeast corner of Florida, essentially. Orange Park is a suburb of Jacksonville.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. How did this, so moving around all the time in the Army, how did that affect your view of relationships? You were constantly having to make new friends and...
That's a good question. I was always the kind of guy who had like one or two good friends. And so I always hated moving. It was awful especially when I was young. Because, when I was young, it was back before email or cell phones or anything like this. So you could write letters, but basically when I was growing up, if I moved away, I was never going to see those people again, ever. So I always hated moving, but then I would make friends. Usually we lived near an Army base, and so there were other kids in the same boat as I was. And I would make friends who were newbies like myself. And then I would have to leave them. The whole thing would repeat over again.
Did you ever run into any of them again? The ones that were also Army brats?
Not really. No, I didn't actually.
That's odd. You would think that at some point.
Yeah, the only one I really kept in contact with was a guy named Kevin. We were born together in Germany, 7 days apart. And I still know him to this day. But my parents and his parents were friends. But after Germany, we never actually lived in the same place until we were both adults. And we both lived in Atlanta for a while.
And have you, now that there's Facebook and everything, have you reconnected with any of those old friends? Or?
No, not really. I wish I could say yes, but really the answer is no. So, I've got good friends now, and these are my keepers, hopefully.
So, with all that change in friends constantly, losing them and making new, your family must have been very important to you. So what's your family dynamic?
Well, I have an older brother, and Dad's retired, and I don't know how to answer this question, actually.
The actual question is, how did family life affect your view of relationships?
Okay.
Want to pass?
No. I guess what it taught me was that there's some people who were going to stick around, because I had my brother and my mom and dad, and ultimately that was enough, actually. And we loved each other and stuck it out, and it was really super tough at times, and so I think, to answer your question, that is why, it taught me about relationships, is that you stick it out. You don't shy away from the hard times. You work through it, and if you can do that successfully, then you're really going to have some great relationships. And sometimes your relationship won't survive that, unfortunately, but the ones that do will be the really good ones.
Okay. What, if any, life events have affected your writing?
Well, obviously all the moving has, because I've been exposed to so many different people and different settings. And so that was, that has obviously affected it very much. Having children has been a huge one. I think being a parent, you get to relive a bit of your childhood. And so I'm sure that has affected it quite a bit, especially when writing stories like Into the Attic of the World, which deals with children, even though those kids are a bit older than my kids are right now.
So how many children do you have, and what are their ages, if you don't mind putting that out in the world?
I have 4 kids. I have 4 kids. A 9-year-old is my youngest, 2 10-year-olds, and an 11-year-old. And they're all their birthdays are super close, within a couple weeks. And so they're all moving up a year here in a few weeks. So,
all right. So, well, that's interesting. You have Christmas and then you have birthday month.
Yeah, we have expensive month and then expensive month.
So, are they at least almost 6 months apart? So it's
yeah.
Well, that's good. At least it's not like December and January.
Right.
Okay. Here we go. Which teacher, and you had a lot of teachers.
I had a lot of teachers.
Which teacher would be most surprised or proud that you had become a novelist?
I think it would have to be like any reading teacher / literature teacher that I had, because that was not my class growing up. I was not a gifted reader. I was, I had, this,
right.
But I had dyslexia, and so my relationship with reading, especially when I was young, was pretty spotty at best, And so I'm actually fairly astonished myself that I write. But I think, who would be least surprised would actually be some of my art teachers through the years, because I was always a very creative person. Mm-hmm. And I was, thinking about this later on in life, I was always coming up with stories. It's just I would show it through drawings and illustrations. Much more than I would writing anything, but I always had a story behind these pictures in my head, at least. Mm-hmm. So
you began your writing career by drawing out your stories.
It's like a caveman. Pictures on the wall. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about that. So, did you ever do anything with any of that art?
Yeah. The first books I ever put out were actually graphic novels. Yeah, I'm still very proud of those graphic novels. It was called the Andy series, and they're available on Amazon. They're still out there. I would do like little jobs, like logos and stuff like that. I did
You designed the cover of my book.
Yeah, that's right. The artwork, I'm still able to use it from time to time with stuff like that, and I was able to design the cover art for this podcast. And I did that Sleepy Sleepy Bear Says a Nighttime Prayer story, but that was claymation.
Right. So very creative. So I had that as a question actually, because you had told me that you had dyslexia. My question to that was, how did you ever become a reader, much less a writer? So do you read now?
Just because my life is so hectic. I take in more stories through audiobooks than I do through sitting down with a book and reading it. There was actually a very defining moment for me in reading and with enjoying stories like a novel. I don't know if you know this story, but when I was a senior in high school, it was
I know this one.
Okay. It was toward the end of the year, and school was winding down, and there probably wasn't much for us to do. I can't remember what class it was, but it was not literature. It was not a reading class. But for whatever reason, this teacher I had decided that he was going to play an audiobook for us. And I think if I remember it correctly, this class was like at the end of the day. And so my time at school would end listening to this audiobook, and the book happened to be The Vampire Lestat by Anne Rice. We could question his judgment on playing this book for us, but I had never read a book like that. I'd never heard a story like that, read to me, and I don't think I'd ever listened to an audiobook up until that point. So I would just sit there at my desk, listen to the story, and kind of get carried away in this world Anne Rice was creating. And so later on, when I would do drawings, or when I was working on the comic book, and I would be sitting at the computer for hours and hours and hours, or sitting at the drawing desk for all this time, and my hands and eyeballs were occupied, I would put in audio CDs and just like devour these stories. I would go to the library, find books on CD or books on tape, whatever. And through that process, and through those years of doing that, I fell in love with these long format stories, and stories that can never really be told in a comic book because the medium doesn't really allow for such a long, elaborate story.
So you are a voracious reader through your ears.
Yeah.
So what's your all-time favorite audiobook?
I have a hard time answering that. Just like I used to say, like, some people had asked me, what's my favorite movie? And I used to just go down the line. I had them all set. But now, I don't know what my favorite movie is. And I don't really know what my favorite book is, especially my favorite audiobook. Probably my all-time favorite would be the Dark Tower series by Stephen King. I love C.S. Lewis. All his books were tremendously impactful to me. I love the Michael Crichton's books. So those three guys really, really did it for me and really got me hooked. And so
Stephen King, horror.
Right.
C.S. Lewis, fantasy and allegory.
Right, and theology as well.
And theology.
Yeah.
And then Michael Crichton, thrillers, medical thrillers, right?
Yeah, you could say they were thrillers, I would say. More scientific, and his writing was very precise. He would put a tremendous amount of research into it, and so that kind of stands out in that way. But yeah, he could really tell a good story. Mm-hmm. Yeah, my favorite Michael Crichton was Eaters of the Dead.
So what are you listening to right now?
I've been slowly working my way through it's called Conan the Barbarian. It's a collection of stories by Robert E. Howard. These stories of Conan were originally published in Strange Tales magazine, like back in the 30s, I think. And so some of them were really good and some of them were But,
so these really are the original. This isn't a takeoff on...
No, these are the original ones.
Oh, wow.
But they were like novelettes.
Mm-hmm. Dime store.
Yeah. And, I grew up with some Conan. There were some Conan movies with Schwarzenegger, so I was aware of Conan. And there was this line from a Conan movie. I would tell this to my kids. Conan's like philosopher, mentor, teacher guy from when he was a kid growing up would say, "Conan, what is the meaning of life?" And Conan would answer, "To crush your enemies, to see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentations of the women." So I don't know why. There's just something about his mentality was so outrageous and hilarious. But so in a way, the movies are very true to these stories that I've listened to, because he still definitely has that personality. And some of his descriptions of Howard's descriptions are very rich. Some of it is really great writing, and then some of it is just pretty cheesy. But yeah, I've enjoyed.
But in the 30s, it might have been that's the style.
Yeah, well, he was really a pioneer in the style, actually. Yeah, the whole sword and sorcery genre. Well, Dalyn, thank you for coming. This has been great. I really enjoyed it.
I enjoyed learning more about you. There were some things I had no idea.
Yeah, well, more to come in the next few off-season shows. So, again, thank you for coming. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, there you have it. I hope you have enjoyed that little discussion. If you want to check out Dalyn's work, her name is spelled Dalyn, Woods, Woods. Her currently available book, My Sister's Keeper, is available on Amazon. She also has 2 novels coming out. The next will be The Bride Escape, and Exposed should come out shortly after that. Join us next week for our second off-season show. Dalyn will be back to host, and I look forward to listening to her next round of questions. If you are new to our podcast and want to enjoy the audio version of my novel Into the Attic of the World for free, set up your podcast app to play the Blue Deck in order of oldest to newest. That way, you can enjoy the story from the beginning. Also, subscribe if you haven't already, and rate the podcast. I love it when people do that. I always read the reviews. So far, they've been extremely flattering. If you want to reach out to me personally, my email is joseph@thebluedeck.com. You can also find me on Twitter @Joseph Mazerac. That is JOSEPHMAZERAC. That concludes this episode. Thanks for listening. See you next week.